so my role will be as passive as I can. I is member of civica. Civica is a work group between different institutions, and actually this is our first event here at IE. So we are very glad that we have joined this group universities. We belong, we are organizing a group on an event on democracy and constitution making, and we have the privilege to have two professors from IE presenting the constitution making process. There is a problem with constitution making process. They don't take place too often. So there is no good book on how we draft constitutions. However, we are glad because we will have Sonsoles, and Sonsoles, she's a professor at IE. She will present the interesting case of Kenya. And Sergio is another professor here at IE, and he's going to present the case of Chile. Actually, both cases, they are interesting because they will open up our horizons about this challenging topic. With that said, I will give the floor to Sonsoles. My bad.
No worries. I was actually just going to say a few words about civica.
Okay, fantastic.
This is a great introduction. So I won't take long. Actually, I'm going to say what you've already said, which is that we're now part of Civica. IE is now part of the European Alliance of Social Science Universities, which includes about 10 leading institutions with whom we organize these sorts of events and other types of events to foster basically academic excellence and, I guess, civic engagement on a European level. So I'm very excited to be having this first seminar series that is hosted jointly with Civica and IE on issues that are evidently very relevant to today's global world. So just that, I'm gonna
Okay, thank you, Rene.
pass on the floor to you, Sonsoles.
Thank you very much. Well, I think Sergio will start firstly. I mean, our idea is to just devote 15-20 minutes to present our specific cases on Kenya and Chile. But firstly, Sergio will address some words explaining how constitution-making processes fail, and maybe given a broad idea of constitution-making processes. And afterwards, I think we will analyze each case. The idea is that in the end, you can also participate and maybe make questions. So the audience has an important role in this seminar.
Thanks, Sonsoles.
Thank you.
So the papers that we wrote are part of a broader project. So I'm gonna say a few words about this broader project. I am not only an author in this project, but I am also editing it. Okay, so the main question that this project asks is how constitution-making processes fail, which is something, as Antonio said correctly, we know very little about so far, and this is not word.
Yeah, that's the screen. That's the screen.
Okay, good. It was very simple. Okay, so so far the literature has focused on what we deem as successful case studies, right? So you have in the picture there the Colombian Constituent Assembly of 1991, and then you have this amazing leader that led the South African constitution-making process in the mid-90s. So we know something about constitution-making processes. The quantitative evidence about constitution-making processes provides only for a few descriptive type of statistics. But most of the things that we actually know about how they operate come from qualitative studies, and those qualitative studies are not always intertwined. So here is a couple of books that try to focus and elaborate what makes these processes successful. But we really know little about them because, as Antonio was explaining, they don't happen very often. They are very separated in time. The contexts are very different so far. So we don't really know what type of lessons we can infer from one case to a new constitution-making processes that are gonna start. We do know, though, the so-called Elster paradox, which means that constitution-making processes typically take place in times of crisis, and the conditions for a successful constitution-making process to happen are unlikely to work well because of that crisis that is out there, right? So we will expect, for example, of a constituent assembly to work relatively well, be responsive to whatever the people want it to be. But because the Constituent Assembly is working in times of crisis, it's very unlikely that that will actually happen. So we have a lot of turbulence and violence and episodes that even pushbacks. And I think France is the typical case study that Elster and others have used to show these problems. France has had 5 constitutions since the revolution so far. So then we have this other literature that came here that is pointing that sometimes constitutions can be made not to establish a democratic regime, but rather to advance an authoritarian or a semi-authoritarian agenda. These are only a few examples of that. And you see the cases of Orban in Hungary and Chavez in Venezuela, but there are other examples as well. And we know a little bit about other processes that have tried to replace the constitution, but they have failed in the attempt to do so. And the main example in the literature usually is Iceland, the experience that they had in 2011, 2012. So we know that there are 2 types of failures in constitution making. First, we know about the authoritarian failure. So failures, constitution making processes that end with an authoritarian regime or with a dominant party regime. And then we have the activation failure, which consists of attempts that try to pass a new constitution, but they fail to do so for some reason. The second type of failure is the one that needs more attention in the discipline, and there's a big gap in trying to understand the reasons, how that happens, and it's the one that the symposium that we are organizing tries to cover. We actually go against conventional wisdom in the literature. In the literature, normally it is assumed that constitution-making processes are actually successful. There's a big literature on referendum, for example, showing that constitutions have 600% chances of being approved compared to reforms to constitutions, and only 11 out of 179 referendums rejected a reform, usually attached to reforms, but not to total constitutional replacement, which is very, very relevant. So there's not really much focus on it, with the exception on specific case studies like those of Iceland that I have just cited. So we need to ask the question of why, or as we were discussing with Sonsoles, the how question, which is a question that is easier to answer than the question of the why, at least at the stage of where the literature is today. So we put together this symposium, which is an ICON symposium. ICON is a journal, the International Journal of Constitutional Law, that will be published at the end of the year. And we compiled case studies from Iceland, Chile, the first process in 2017, Kenya, Spain, the Federalist Spanish Constitution of the 19th century, the Chilean process, and then there will be an epilogue bringing other cases from Rosalind Dixon and David Landau. So this is more or less where the project is situated. And what we're going to do today is to present you 2 of these pieces of the puzzle. There are, of course, more processes out there that require attention. The process of the Constitution of Israel, I think, is a very good example. There have been failures in Pakistan, in Nepal, in France as well, that also require some attention that we are not attacking in this symposium. Unfortunately, I mean, we have a limit of what we can do, but we expect that with all these cases, we can at least provide some evidence to theorize further on the explanations for the failures. So, Sonsoles.
Thank you very much, Sergio. So I think now it's time to start with the Kenya, piece of Kenya. Does anybody come from Kenya in the room? You come from Kenya, so maybe you can help me. You can complete with, I did a research about the process in Kenya until 2005. Of course, I came from Kenya. So maybe in the end, you can help me to complete why the constitution making process in Kenya finally failed. What did that process fail? Well, I will just mention 2 points of historical background. Firstly, then I will explain what was the current constitution in the moment the constitution making process starts in 1997. Then, of course, I just will explain a few steps in the constitution making process and why finally the constitution making process failed in 2005. I will tell you in advance, via referendum, the Kenyan citizens vote no to the draft, to the constitution in that moment. Kenya got its independence in 1963 from the British government and becomes a new country, an independent country. There were different conferences before in Lancaster, in London, with the British government in order to achieve independence. The different political groups in the country tried to design a political system in the country, and they finally draft a constitution, which is passed, approved in 1963. This constitution, also known as the Constitution of Independence, is the first constitution for the independent Kenya, is the one who will be subject to multiple, countless amendments, to the point that there is a moment that the constitution can be even recognized. So many amendments in a few years, in a short period of time, that the constitution itself can't be recognized. So the 1963 constitution is the current one, the first constitution in independent Kenya. But at that moment when the constitution is approved, there is already some problems, some political problems in the country. First of all, there are two political issues. Kenya political groups didn't agree at that moment. The first one is the territorial distribution of the power, whether be a unitary country or a more decentralized country is a problem that the different political groups didn't agree at that moment. And the second one is whether to establish in Kenya a presidential or a parliamentary system. I think you are students, first year students, you are now having constitutional law. So you may know the difference between a presidential and a parliamentary system, and it differs a lot in terms of how the country, thank you, Antonius, they should know, is designed. So this is one issue, one political issue, one topic. It's not pacific, it's controversial in the country. There's also another factor we have to take into account in Kenya, and it's the there are more than 40 ethnic groups in the country. We have more than 40 ethnic groups. Because of how Africa was divided in the 19th century and the 20th century, Kenya divided the different ethnic groups, and there is a high variety of ethnic groups in the country, and they can represent different political interests. And another problem is that because how the constitution was designed in 1963 and before 1963, people didn't feel the constitution belonged to them. People were really dissatisfied with the constitution. This is something that happened in the moment when the constitution is approved. So many problems at the beginning are at stake on the table in that moment. I would like to mention in 15 minutes, I will just highlight the very most basic problems of this process, but the process is more complex than this. But just to understand how the process failed. There were in 1963 two main political parties. KANU was one of these political groups, and KADU was the second one. Now, KANU is the Kenya African National Union. Jomo Kenyatta is the leader of that party, and the KADU is the Kenya African Democratic Union, whose leader is Arap Moi. Well, those parties were had different ideas on how Kenya was supposed to be designed, whereas KANU defended the country should be a presidential system and a unitary one. The KADU, which represented more ethnic groups, defended that Kenya should be a parliamentary system with a prime minister and a head of the state, different than the prime minister, and a very decentralized, a regional country. both of them, in order to get their different political interests, they decided to pass to approve the constitution, even though when they didn't agree with the topics or the design included in the constitution. In order to achieve, in order to be independent as a country, these two main political groups approved the constitution or pushed for the constitution to be approved. But that constitution wasn't very welcome in the people and welcome in the different parties. That is why it will be amended. It was amended so many times. Very briefly, 1 year later, the constitution was approved. The president at that moment, who was Jomo Kenyatta, started the process to amend the constitution. The first amendment was to change the parliamentary system that the constitution state or recognized for Kenya and into a presidential system. So this was the first amendment, a very important amendment to do on a constitution, to change the political system from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. And Jomo Kenyatta will start another different amendments in the following 10 years, more than 11 amendments, not to adapt the constitution to the society or to the necessities of the society, but to obtain different political benefits. This is one point I would like to highlight, and maybe this feature helps to understand why the constitution making process failed. So Jomo Kenyatta and his party, KANU, will take the constitution and amend it to obtain a political benefit. Something to mention is that the two big parties, KANU and KARU, shortly in 1964, will join and become one single party. This event affects to the future of the country, because from that moment on in Kenya, there is just one single party de facto, one single political party. Why do you think it is important in terms of the amendments to the constitution a parliament can start? If you only have one single party, you have the vast majority of the houses of the parliament to approve any type of constitutional amendment. And this is what happened in Kenya the moment the KANU and the KARU united and become one single party. This de facto one single party system became an de jure one party system in 1992. In 1992, there is an amendment to the constitution that officially and formally says, so legally says, that, 1 minute, I will find it. There shall be in Kenya only one political party, the Kenya African National Union. From that moment on, in 1982, Kenya becomes a de jure one single party system, so an authoritarian system. It's from that moment when the people in Kenya starts to ask for a change in the country, a change of the constitutional system, and people claim for a new constitution. And when the constitution making process starts, there is another international event that affects this or adds this claim for a new constitution, which is when the Berlin Wall fall down. All the Western countries ask the African countries to start a democratization process. So Kenya needs to adapt this one single party system to a more plural political system. That is why the president at that moment hears the people's claim and starts the constitution making process. In 1990, yes, at the beginning of the 1990, from 1990 to 1997, people start to claim for a change in the country and to the constitution, a new constitution in the country. Formally, the process starts in 1997, and it will last for almost 10 years, from 1997 to 2005. let's see a little bit about the different stages in this constitution making process. The beginning, well, it starts in 1997, and as any constitution making process you may study with Antonio or Sergio, because my students are from Segovia, so and they're not here. But any constitution making process requires different assemblies and different conventions. The first one, to draft a new constitution. The second one, to hear the different associations, different people's groups, and the background of the street, so the people's will to draft a constitution that can incorporate, can have all the people's interests and all the people's requirements. And there's also final ratification of that document, the so-called draft, constitutional draft, that can be done by the parliament, but nowadays normally by who? Who ratifies the constitution nowadays, mostly? You students know the answer? Who can ratify the constitution? The people. Through which mechanism? A referendum. This is how the constitution making process was designed in Kenya. I'm just highlighting the main stages, but all of them are at different social problems in the streets, with manifestation, demonstrations, violence, and riots. But this is basically what the constitution making process designed. Three main steps: a commission, which that we will draft the document, the draft; the National Constitutional Conference that will review the draft and will approve it, and then it will be finally the process initially designed to be ratified by the parliament, but we will see that the Supreme Court will change this and will require the people to be ratifying the constitution. There is something that happened in 2001 that changed everything. After the constitution making process is ongoing and they have a draft made by this conference and the National Conference, they have a draft in the constitution making process, and they will call it the BOMAS draft, because they met in Nairobi in one place called BOMAS. So the draft made by this constituent power by this conference is called the BOMAS draft. It includes all the people's claims, how the country should be designed, how the power should be divided, whether they wanted to have a bicameral system, a parliamentary system. But suddenly the government, the new government elected in 2002, decided to draft a new constitution. The Attorney General, which family name is Wako, approved a new draft asked by the government, and there's suddenly then a new constitution draft, or a new draft for the constitution, the so-called Wako draft. So in 2003, the Kenyan people have two different drafts, one made by the conference, the constitutional conference, which passed through a constitution making process who lasted so many times. And then they have another draft made by the government in that moment in 2002 that has to be passed, has to be approved. And the government called for a referendum in 2005. Maybe I'm doing things very simple and they weren't so simple, but this is how facts happen mostly, basically. And the referendum takes place in 2005, in November. As a binary, referenda are usually include a binary question, and which can be answered by yes or no. Those who supported the government draft, the Wako draft, were represented with the bananas, and they obviously voted yes to the constitution. And those citizens who weren't in favor of this government draft were represented with different oranges, another type of fruit, and they would vote no to that draft in the referendum. What happened in the end? That the no won over the yes, and the Wako draft, the governmental constitution, was rejected by the Kenyan people, the people in Kenya in 2005. And this is very shortly explained, how the process in Kenya failed. There are multiple factors, multiple circumstances why the
If you can go back, because I didn't understand the bananas and the oranges.
Okay, bananas was the fruit that represented all citizens in favor of the government draft.
Who made that?
The government, I mean, for the question in the referendum was, are you for or against the ratification of the proposed new constitution?
So they wanted
But
to
the
bring-
new constitution was the Guaco
Guaco,
one,
okay.
not the Bomas. Bomas was just simply set aside for the government. And they put a new one, the Guaco one.
I'm impressed with the way they did the referendum with bananas and no oranges.
In order to make it simple for citizens, they decided to use fruits. So if you are for the government new draft, you are a banana. If you are against, you are an orange. I mean, and you have this to vote. I'm orange, I'm against the government draft. Or I vote bananas, I'm for bananas, I'm for the government draft. But the thing is, in this point, it's important to say that people did an amazing or had an amazing role in this process. They were well-formed, well-informed, and they knew the constitution they wanted to approve. This is important in Kenya. That's why the no won over the yes, and they rejected the government draft. I need to explain, or maybe the student, that 5 years later, a new constitution will be finally approved in 2010. They have a current constitution approved in 2010. They learned from the failures the political groups did in this process, and they passed a new constitution, but it took 5 years more to approve a new one. What would be the main, key features or key consequence or effects of this process? Well, they had a constitution, a political crisis since the constitution of 1963 was approved, and they never solved that problem. They didn't face that part of the country wanted a presidential system and the other part of the country wanted a parliamentary system, and they never agreed on whether to have a federal or regional country or a unitary one. And they simply passed the 1963 constitution just to get independence. But they knew from the beginning they didn't like that constitution. They just wanted the so-called, in Swahili, ururu, or independence. Do you speak Swahili?
I understand what that is.
Okay, ururu, I think, means independence. No, there was also the ururu constitution, the constitution of independence. The multiple amendments the constitution had since its beginning made the constitution useless. You can't, and your constitutional law professors will explain to you guys, you can't have a constitution approved in your country and simply modify it so many times in a short period of time that you can't even recognize the constitution, the original the constitution that was approved. Another factor, very important feature of this process is that the political groups use the constitution they amend it, not to adapt to the society, but to obtain a political benefit. They amend the constitution to avoid crises, to maintain the power, to maintain themselves in the power, to keep themselves in the power. So they use the amendment process for interests, personal and political interests. And the two unresolved political problems I said before, whether having a unitary or regional or federal country and a parliamentary and a presidential system. And also the referendum, this is important, 1 minute, was used by the people not to pass the constitution, but to banish the government. So referendum was also used in a wrong way by the people. Let me explain this. People didn't want to go and vote to the referendum to pass or to reject the constitution. People went to approve or reject the government. And so the referendum, in the end, wasn't a way to ratify a constitution, but a way to vote or to reject the government. And you had a question.
But in 1963, I know they wanted to establish independence, but why not create a provisional constitution instead of set in stone constitution?
It would be a nice idea. I think the will to become an independent country was more important than preserve some important things, and maybe exactly that's a provisional constitution, for example, like the basic law in Germany. The Indian was the constitution, but initially it was a provisional basic law. Good idea. Mhm.
Like the basic idea of the constitution is supposed to be able to establish how the political system of the country should work. So then would the 1963 constitution really count for the constitution?
It is formally because the process it was approved, because it counted with all the main political groups agreeing on it. But the thing is, nobody wanted as it was. All of them wanted to amend it in the very first moment they could. This is the problem. I don't know if we can open the questions, so maybe later, Sergio,
So what?
Antonios.
My initial idea was to have both presentations and have the Q&A session together, because I think that Sergio will bring also in the discussion interesting points. So is that okay?
Of course, you're the chairman.
I was thinking that please write down your questions, and then we will have a discussion with both panelists, and that will be interesting to listen to both responding to these questions. So Sergio, you have 15 minutes. You can always extend it a couple of minutes.
Okay, maybe 30 minutes then.
Then I will exercise my constitutional duty.
So this is a paper I'm co-writing with Samuel Issacharoff from NYU. And the argument that we are trying to make is a comparative argument. It's larger than Chile, which is our case study. So we dialogue with other examples as well, even though Chile is the in-depth case study that we actually perform, and we use secondary sources to bring the other examples together. And the core argument is it's a normative argument, actually. Has to do with how constitution making processes should be organized and designed if you want them to be successful, and avoid the two types of failures that I described before, the authoritarian failure and the activation failure. And the answer to this question is that you need to have rival parties operating with bipartisan agreements producing the constitution. This is a necessary condition for the success. It is not a sufficient condition for the success. And this is the argument that we're trying to make. And we're aware that there are costs for this, because political parties, of course, are not very popular in the world. There is a crisis of the political parties in the world today. So people may reject them, and there are costs associated with it. There are incumbency and legitimacy costs associated with it. Incumbency costs consist of political parties that are already in the representative institutions of the country, so they may have interest to keep some of those. And the political costs have to do with the fact that the political parties have lost a lot of reputation during the past few years all over the world, and those legitimacy costs may be triggered also to the constitution making process. Being aware of this cost and risk, we still argue that it is a necessary condition for this to operate. And we work under specific assumptions. So we're not making the argument in a universal way. What we're saying is that this argument should only work for democratic regimes that are reasonably competitive today, but fragile and subject to authoritarian backlash. So if a country is building the constitution for the first time, we are speaking about the French Revolution, for example, this argument won't probably apply. Right? Because in those cases, you are more likely to want to dismantle everything that happened before and not take, because you have nothing really democratic to take from before. So the argument is applicable for contemporary democracies that are nevertheless flawed or fragile today, like the cases that I showed there. Bolivia and Ecuador, the two cases that I put at the top, didn't follow the recipe with the problems that they had. And then we had the case of Iceland and Bachelet here. Bachelet, she did an attempt to replace the constitution in 2017 in Chile, which failed, who also didn't follow these these prescriptions as I will show. Why political parties? Because so theoretically, political parties are the only way in which we can maximize substantive representation, and I mean substantive representation, not descriptive or formal types of or symbolic types of representation. And substantive representation is essential for achieving consensus that are large enough to represent large sectors of the society. Also, because we are in the context of a democratic country, even though flawed, we need to make sure that some democratic elements will remain. For example, if you have an independent judiciary, you don't want to undermine the independence of the judiciary. Therefore, you need to add elements to secure the institutional continuity in the country, and parties are good for that precisely because of the incumbency problem they have. There is massive evidence showing that bipartisan agreements tend to produce more liberal outputs in constitution making and constitutional reform. Even though all this evidence shows specific types of rules, for example, the independence of judicial review, the creation of a Bill of Rights, the constraints to executive power, the independence of public prosecutors, and so on. All this evidence, if you look at it overall, you will identify that if you want to build constraints of political power in the future, you need this. Why? Because when you have these political dynamic, parties will tend to control each other. And in the context of electoral uncertainty, they will want to ensure themselves for the future so that nobody can get complete control of the apparatus of the state during the constitution-making process or after the constitution-making process using the institutions created by the new constitution. So I think this is a normatively, so it's empirically grounded, but the argument works normatively well, I think. The main tension here is that normally, because of the crisis of the political parties today, there's a lot of pressure to use independence and single issue groups, social movements, to write constitutions. The intuition is that political parties have interests that are not aligning well with whatever the people want to do. So let's give the pen to groups like feminist groups, environmental groups, indigenous groups, whatever group is popular at that time, and to have them performing these issues. I am arguing, my argument is a little bit politically incorrect, but I'm not a politician, so I don't care, fighting against this. I think this is a really, really bad idea. And the Chilean case is a good illustration of this. It undermines substantive representation. It ends up in a very bad constitution that is not consistent in its institutional part, which is what the constitution should focus more, and it ends up with a very, very generous constitution that is very hard to realize at the level of the aspirations and rights it is included. So this brings me to my case study, the Chilean Constitutional Convention. So in Chile, there have been different attempts to change the constitution, and the one that interests me for this particular case is the convention that ended last year, so 2022, in which the exit referendum of the process, the 64% of the voters, with a very high turnout of more than 80%, decided to say no to the constitutional proposal that the convention that the people elected in the first place proposed to them. This is something that surprised many. This convention was very, very, very popular among certain elite in Chile, but also among international observers. It was so popular that the president of the convention, Elisa Loncón, which is a Mapuche, an indigenous woman, got herself the cover in the Time magazine, and people like her were invited all over the world to give conferences and explain how to do constitution making, and they were very, very wrong. Okay, and I want to explain why. So let me give you a little bit of background about Chile. So the first thing is that Chile today has a constitution that has a sin of origin. It was originated during a dictatorship imposed by a military junta in 1980. The constitution was subject to a referendum at that time, but everybody knew at that time that the democratic conditions for the referendum were not existent. So the constitution included a very important authoritarian component in it, which was partly removed afterwards. But the constitution was never really replaced. However, after the military regime ended in 1989, more than 60 amendments had passed for Chile. And many, not only amendments, but sub-constitutional reforms and judicial interpretations of the Constitution also made the Constitution very, very different. If you compare the Constitution of Chile today versus the political plan that Pinochet and the military junta wanted in 1980, you will see that they are completely different. Chile has a new Constitution, but it didn't have it didn't produce a political gesture big enough to convince the people that there was a new constitution detached from the dictatorship. So this triggered a crisis of legitimation in the constitution itself, which was affecting the authority of the judges, of the Congress, and even of the president. These are some of the differences. If you want the slide, I can send it to you after. These are some of the differences of the original plan of the Pinochet constitution and the constitution that we see today, which are massive. Okay, one of the issues is that we never in Chile really, and I say we because I'm Chilean, we never really discussed what the new constitution will entail, right? What we did is to produce this kind of as an accident through gradual incremental amendments and political practices and judicial interpretations that were not being released in a consistent or systematic way. And the amendments were never considered to be enough. There was a symbolic problem. Some people, mainly from the left, used the Constitutional Court's jurisprudence during the Bachelet regime to argue that the Constitution was putting important speed bumps on progressive social reforms Chileans cared about. How? Because the Constitutional Court struck down some of the bills that Bachelet was proposing in matters such as labor law, the rights of employees, consumer protection law, university tuition, and other things that people really cared about. So they used this jurisprudence also to say that the Constitution turned itself into a big stop sign for social reform. The problem is that all of these things created an issue of legislative inertia. So social reforms were not passed. Whatever the causes happened, Congress was always gridlocked. It was very hard until today to pass a relevant reform in areas such as healthcare and social security, which are the most important present items today in Chile, and even larger security issues because of that gridlock. So there was a constitutional replacement attempt before, right? In Ricardo Lagos tried to do it in 2005 when he passed more than 50 amendments in one very big amendment, but the parties declined. They declined him the gesture, this is a new constitution. It was very interesting because he provided a lot of substance. So he removed the authoritarian enclave from the constitution. For example, there was a rule allowing non-elected senators to sit in the Senate. He removed all of those rules. And he also tried to make this symbolically important. So he replaced the signature of Pinochet by his own signature. So it was going to be the constitution of Lagos, not the constitution of Pinochet. And Lagos was a socialist president that had opposed Pinochet, was one of the leaders of the opposition to Pinochet. So this could have been very relevant, right? Not only because he loved himself, but also because he was really trying to symbolically convince everyone that there was a new constitutional order. And he didn't. Why? Well, political parties denied the democratic gesture. They approved the amendments, but they treated it only as an amendment. The right wing was still connected to the Pinochet regime, and the left did not want to resign to the idea to replace the constitution that they wanted to have with strong social rights and so on in the future. Then we had Bachelet's attempt in 2017. Bachelet tried to do it without the political parties. He convoked a set of roundtable meetings that citizens in a bottom-up way organized themselves and presented proposals. He grabbed everything and her team wrote a constitution. She sent it to Congress and Congress dropped it. Why? Because she never included the parties in the process. So the parties turned themselves into, hey, you need to include us. It's not that we don't want to do it, but you need to include us. Parties care a lot about their own interests, of course. And then the constitution-making process that failed. And now we have a new constitution-making process that is also going to fail, probably according to what the polls are showing in December. So the constitution making process of 2022 that failed started actually in 2019. It was the so-called social outbreak. It started with a group of students that decided not to pay the metro of Santiago in response to the rise of the price of the metro ticket, which was made by a technocratic procedure that was unaccountable to anybody. So the students were very, very mad and they decided not to pay. So it started with the image on the right, with those type of things. And then other people started to join. It was not only about the students, but it was also about people that were not receiving retirement pensions enough. It was also people that were complaining about the healthcare system. It was also about the feminists. It was also about the environmentalists. It was also about the indigenous people. It was also about people complaining about water rights. The problem of water in Chile is particularly relevant. And so on. So a lot of different movements started to join the students, and they ended up with probably the historically more massive demonstration that Chile has ever had. And they asked many of them, not all of them, they started to ask the president to resign, but there was a problem of leadership. Nobody really led this movement. It was very inorganic. It was composed by different social movements that tried to articulate each other, but they really never had a face, like a leader you could negotiate with. Next to the protest, also violence came. Nearly 80 metro stations were burned. Many hotels, restaurants, and supermarkets were completely sacked. The apparatus of the state was overhauled. So the president decreed emergency regime, and he threw the military to the streets, and human rights abuses existed, which boosted more demonstrations. And the demonstrations even got to the personal house of the president. I mean, the situation was completely out of control. The parties met in Congress and decided, you know what? Let's respond to this and let's do a new constitution. Basically, we can gather all of these groups, channels, all of these demands, and reply with a very important gesture. You know, we're gonna do a new constitution, so we placate the demonstration. So the constitution making process was opened as a way to respond to the threat of the institutions becoming overwhelmed. In the polls of that time showed that most people agreed with having a new constitution because they connected it with social rights issues. That was the main explanation of that time. And this was a very good explanation because it allowed to combine education, healthcare, social security, and other issues that were very, very important. Housing is another one that I was forgetting that is very important also in Chile. The problem is that constitutions, we know, that can do very little about social rights in the text. They can actually do very, very, very little. But as a political narrative, it was very, very successful. And I think that Bachelet herself was planting the seeds of connecting the issue of social reform and building a welfare state with the need to create a new constitution. And the idea was started to become popular, and people connected the problems of not having proper treatment in a hospital and not having proper housing because of the existence of the Pinochet constitution. Whether you want to challenge that connection, which I do challenge that connection, or not, it was the perceived preferences from the citizens themselves at that time. So the November agreement ended up in, you know, we're gonna open this constitution making process. We're gonna start with a referendum, whether the people will decide whether they want a new constitution or not. And they're also gonna vote whether they want a constituent assembly or whether they want a mixed organ composed partly of citizens and partly of sitting legislators to write the constitution. And they designed this with a lot of limits. It was very highly detailed, highly regulated, procedural limits, substantive limits. They did not, for example, they were not allowed to violate existing decisions from the Supreme Court. For example, if there were complaints, they could go to the Supreme Court. It was very, very, very regulated. So it was a post-sovereign design. They were trying to avoid what had happened in previous years in the region, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and in Bolivia. They wanted to fight that. That's why I have argued that this process tried to be a middle ground between the Pinochet model, the right-wing conservative neoliberal model on the one side, and the Latin American socialist left on the other side. They try to build something in between. So they designed an electoral system for the Constituent Assembly that partly resembled the way the Chamber of Deputies in Chile was organized. The Chamber of Deputies in Chile looked at that time like this. So you could see that the right, which is the blue, the Chile Vamos, and the different groups of the left are kind of tied. There's a slight majority for the left, but it's not such a majority. So if you have the same electoral rules to elect the Constituent Assembly than the Chamber of Deputies, and you ask them to write a constitution by 2/3 of the votes, then the expectation was, you know, we're gonna have bipartisan agreements here. It was the perfect design. But they didn't succeed. They planned it wrong. They were trying to avoid this. This is the Venezuelan Constituent Assembly. Okay? The Venezuelan Constituent Assembly, controlled by Hugo Chavez. 90% of the seats with only 60% of the votes. But then things changed. The parties decided to add gender parity. Of course, it was a very reasonable, sensitive demand, very popular, so they did it. They also established special rules for independents. They allowed independents to compete side to side against the parties and to build coalitions among them. Nobody knew who these independents were. Most of them were going to come from the social movements that were in the protests. But they were allowed to compete against the parties, and then reserved seats for indigenous people. This means that all the indigenous people of Chile will have had secured seats, and even despite the low turnout and the low votes that they could receive, they will still have those seats secured. Some people complained that this was violating the principle of one person, one vote, but it was still approved. In the plebiscite, 77.85% agreed with changing the constitution, and 78.97%, which is higher, for the Constituent Assembly totally elected. And then the elections came, and the elections. Remember that the elections were trying to replicate what happened in the Chamber of Deputies, but instead of having a kind of tight constitution, they had this. So Vamos por Chile, which is the right-wing coalition, only got 37 seats out of 155. And the rest is, the Apruebo is the traditional center-left, and the rest is different groups from the left, including the indigenous peoples, which aligned with the left and were articulated by people with connections with the Communist Party, in particularly, but with others as well. A new group arose, the so-called Lista del Pueblo, the list of the people. They fragmented afterwards. The Lista del Pueblo was a very radical position that had called, these are the guys from the Lista del Pueblo. They campaigned on the basis of killing President Piñera, a literal death. That was their campaign. The proposals they had were not very known. All of these movements were anti-established movements. People that were mad against the regime or against the parties were voting for them. So there was kind of a negative reaction against the parties and a support for these movements, but we didn't really know much about what these movements were doing. And many of them actually didn't know themselves, right? Because they were driven by particular interests. So for example, a couple of members came from the agenda of regionalization. So they only care about decentralizing Chile. Others from the indigenous platforms, others from the environmental platforms, and all of them started to add preferences. And that's how the Constituent Assembly ended up working. They added all these preferences together, and they put together the 2/3 they needed to approve the new constitution, right? So there was a lot of pressure also to violate the rules given at the beginning. In the end, they respected the 2/3 rule, but there was a lot of pressure, and they ended up removing the center left, the center, and the right wing from the negotiations. They didn't need it. The problem is that if you look at the larger political landscape, these groups, even though they lack reputation because all the parties are having a crisis, all of these groups were providing substantive representation to larger sectors of society by defending conservative or centrist approaches that were not represented in the convention in the end. So the convention ended up approving a lot of norms that were outside the very far away from the median voter. There were also a lot of political scandals. Many of them were connected to the fact that a lot of the independents that were elected were not experienced politicians, so they were making a lot of mistakes, communicational mistakes, but also strategic mistakes, and they were being fragmented a lot. I could give you some very funny examples later if you want to, because they're very, very funny, but some of them are actually very, very sad. And they also proposed a lot of norms that were completely against the November Agreement. Those norms really didn't pass, but they make a lot of noise, and people started to distrust in the assembly very, very strongly. Even though they started with an approval, you could say, because of the entry referendum of 78%, they ended up losing by 64%. And if you look at the norms they approved and the polls of that time, you will see that there was a serious mismatch between what the voters, the majority of the voters wanted, and the proposal wanted. So the constitutional proposal reflected the interests of all the groups, right? They were just adding preferences, a long list of rights, a little attention to the political system. The political parties were not used. Instead of fixing the party system, the proposal was weakening the party system even more. So they were not fixing the problem of political gridlock that existed at that country at the same time. And in the campaign, the proposal was so far away from the preferences of the median voter that those that wanted to approve it made a call to the people to approve it anyway and promised to amend it after. Let's approve it, aprobar para reformar. Let's approve it and let's amend it later. And those that were campaigning in favor of the rejection did exactly the opposite. Let's reject it, but let's still get rid of the Pinochet constitution. So let's start a new process afterwards. And this is how the two options were actually communicated to the citizens. No perfect options. So of course, citizens were particularly disappointed by this process. Also, the presidential approval rates were the president started to lose popularity a lot, and because the president was supporting the approval, this may have harmed the. Yes, I'm going to finish now, and this is basically. Thank you.
No, but I didn't want to interrupt. Feel free to conclude. You have a couple of minutes to conclude if you want.
No, so the main, just to wrap up the argument.
Please. Sorry.
So the argument is that
I didn't.
in the context of a flawed but competitive democracy with existing representative institutions, the purpose of constitution making should be to fix those democratic institutions, particularly the political parties, and not to try to replace them or circumvent them, because you may end up with an authoritarian failure, like in Venezuela, or you may then end up with an activation failure, like in Chile or in Iceland. Why that happens? It happens because the parties can resist proposals where they are not represented, or it can also happen because the citizens will react against the flawed, not substantive representation that the convention will have. Many people were saying that the convention was totally representative, but they were saying that in descriptive or symbolic terms. The convention was very socially inclusive in the sense that it was including all social classes, not the typical people that came from the typical 7 high schools in Chile, but everyone. But it performed very poorly in substantive representation. So ideas were not reflecting what the median voter wanted, and parties cannot be replaced by single issue movements because of this. And we can speak more about the benefits of political parties for representative democracies later if you.